So today happens to be the spookiest of days, and though I don't tend to get massively into all the antics and stuff of the day, I couldn't help but dive into the collection to find a gem which fits the season. And so it's time to dive into the spookiness of Master of Darkness for the Master System. This is Beyond the Scanlines, a series focusing on interesting games on classic computing and gaming platforms. Master of Darkness was released for the Master System in 1992 both in Europe and Brazil, and was developed by Sibs, a studio who did quite a bunch of other cool games for Sega. Alongside that, it would also see a worldwide release on the Game Gear, taking advantage of the hardware being an evolution of that which was part of the Master System. It's the 19th century, and though things may seem idyllic in London, there's a dark undercurrent running beneath. An undercurrent fueled by vicious murders occurring at night under the full moon. Dr. Ferdinand Social has received troubling warnings through his Ouija board, warnings of more murders to come. And so the intro fades out, and Dr. Social's quest begins, opening up on the banks of the Thames as he seeks to stop the next gruesome attack. Each of the game's rounds opens up with one of these story sequences which do wonders in updating you on the Doctor's investigations, especially because these investigations take him to a variety of locales, rather than just moving through a single site. Time to get the biggest thing out of the way with this, so I'm just going to say it. Yes, this is very much inspired by the Castlevania games. Depending on what kind of games player you are or viewer, that might be enough for you to just dismiss this and move on. But that's not really what I'm about here, so despite the core mechanical similarities, there are quite a few details which Master of Darkness does, which makes it stand out in its very own way. As such, it's more than worthy of its own exploration. The first of these elements is with its weapons. Rather than carrying a single weapon and upgrading it through item pickups, here you'll find those pickups change which weapon the Doctor can wield. He starts out with a dagger, a weapon not known for its damage prowess, or range for that matter. The other weapons he can use, sabers, stakes, and axes, all offer different combinations of both range and damage potential. So working out the balance of those which works best for your playstyle can make for quite a different style of play, especially when it comes to that pesky social distancing against the undead masses. And yes, that is a stake you can collect. It is not a hammer, nor is it a cane. The latter of which is what I initially thought it was. At least before going back to the manual to check exactly what it was. Limitations of 8-bit graphics, am I right? But enough of that. The one trick though is that unlike that other game, you can't collect everything you'll see released from the item masks. For one, because you're switching between weapons, it's very easy to find yourself accidentally picking up the dagger, particularly because they tend to be located in places where it would be most inconvenient to do so. Like being inside the last item mask you'll encounter before you face the end of round boss. Kind of inconvenient. But back to those item masks. And those primary weapons aren't the only items they'll drop. Once you crack them open like a piñata, you'll find globes which give you more points, life potions which recover health in a far more sanitary way than digging up wall meat. Then there's the rare and customary extra lives. The most handy one though is the screen clearing emerald, which absolutely does what it says on the tin, clears the screen of enemies and nets you even more points. You'll also find a set of secondary weapons in the form of guns, bombs, boomerangs, and projectiles. Yes, those last ones are actually called that. These all offer ranged attacks, which complement those of your primary weapons quite nicely. Of course, these are limited by ammunition, and so the only way to get more shots out of them is by finding them again in other item masks around the map. Importantly, these are real handy for taking on the bosses, at least for helping you keep your distance. Especially if you locked out and you're stuck with the not so trusty dagger as you need to take one on. Speaking of the bosses, they're found at the end of each of the game's 5 rounds. Said rounds are split up into 3 separate levels, and each level has a number of separate scrolling sections. As for the types of challenge they offer, well, I don't feel they're up there with the hardest of what you'd get in the 8-bit eras. But if you are not properly equipped with the right weapon, it means that they're not going to be easy to dispatch at all. What could make both of those encounters, and just the platforming in general, a little painful at times, is being sent back to the start of the current level when you die. Now, the levels themselves aren't lengthy, but there's just enough to them that being sent back to the start will usually require some replay to catch up with where you were, and that can be quite painful, especially if you died right in the middle of a boss fight. Had you respawned at, say, the start of the current section, then I feel it would have been less backtracking involved to catch up, and it would have made the experience a little less frustrating when the inevitable happens. Especially because Castlevania uses a similar setup as well, with its stages split into 3 parts. The difference though is Castlevanias are much shorter in length, so when you do die, you find you don't need to backtrack as much. And it's certainly a stroke of fairness in its favour. Now, it kind of needs it based on how challenging that game can get at times, but any advantage towards fairness is more than welcome in my book. There's one detail with Master of Darkness's level design that I truly dig. The way in which it crafts an illusion that its linear levels aren't quite as linear as you may think. This translates to seeing levels offer a limited form of branching. Some of these branches are trap-based, and it makes for a neat trick to discover the way through when you do happen to fall foul of them. It's not much in the grand scale of things, but I found it helped make the challenge that bit more accessible, particularly as someone who didn't really cut his teeth on these kinds of games back in his youth. Something I also found helped was the controls. Now, this might be controversial in some degree, because I'm sure Dr. Social's ability to change direction mid-jump is not entirely a decision that fans would love. For me though, it makes it far more approachable, as making a mistake whilst learning the levels isn't automatically fatal, as it would be in some other games. As a result, things are far more forgiving, and it's certainly why Master of Darkness stands out for me quite a bit in fact. I'm sure that in the eyes of many folk it's probably been written off to some extent, like most of the Master System's library in fact, but you know something? It's their loss to skip games like this, games which offer alternate takes on mechanics and tropes offered by familiar classics. Sure, it's not a blindingly original game, and it's not going to introduce new elements or mechanics to the genre, but that's okay. It's more than fine for games to have taken existing mechanics and concepts and introduced them to a new audience, especially when it's being done as well as it has been done here. In fact, in places, particularly on a visual front, I would say Master of Darkness has won over its counterpart, thanks to the extra colours allowed for sprites and background ties by the Master System's hardware. And with those more flexible jumping controls, it's a game which is certainly far more accessible for players who might not really stand the stiffer jumping which Castlevania offers. I'm not going to deny that its inspiration does draw quite close at times, particularly in the form of some of the levels you'll explore. Though to be honest, it doesn't rile me that much because it makes, you could see it as a parallel universe exploration of the game, in a bit of a strange way. And ultimately, that sums up Master of Darkness for me in general. It's a fun experience which takes those familiar tropes and makes them more accessible in some ways, and marries it up to some solid presentation and visuals. All up, it's certainly one which is worth taking your time to check it out. And so, we've reached the end of yet another video. If you enjoyed this look at a spooky slice of game which falls somewhat off the beaten track, then consider hitting the thumbs up on this video and perhaps tell your friends as well. Word of mouth may not really seem like much, but trust me, a personal recommendation for a video you enjoyed really helps out oh so much in these complex times. If you happen to be after more chill explorations of games like this, then do consider subscribing to the channel and, hitting the notification bell. Sit back, then relax, and catch new episodes as I publish them. A shout out as always goes to the channel supporters over on Patreon. Their support helps out an incredible amount in what I'm doing here and making these videos possible. If you want to help support what I'm doing too, then check the links in the description for how you can join them. Finally, but most importantly, thank you all for taking another voyage beyond the Scanlines.